to education in the Asia-Pacific region. We are gathered here to discuss the findings of the regional case studies and their overarching synthesis. And now it is indeed a great privilege to introduce Mr. Burhan Shokreen, the Director of the Division of Policies and Lifelong Learning Systems at UNESCO headquarters in Paris. Mr. Shakroon is at the vanguard of global policy and trends shaping education and training systems and aligned with the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. So we extend a warm virtual welcome to Burhan and thank you so much for joining us digitally from Paris. Over to you.
Thank you, Ferial, and very good afternoon, good morning, maybe good evening for colleagues who are joining online as well. This is a pleasure and honor to be with you today to open this very important event. On behalf of UNESCO and UNU IAS, it's a pleasure and to welcome you all to this event. I think we have a goal together today is to exchange ideas, advance our global dialogue around the impact of climate change and displacement on the right to education. As you know, we have launched a landmark regional report called Asia Pacific Regional Synthesis, Climate Change, Displacement and the Right to Education, which we released on the International Mother Earth Day a month ago almost. So our gathering today is critical. We are here to look together on the catastrophic effect that climate change, loss of biodiversity, impact on natural heritage is having on the right to education. I think evidence are clear about its impact, but also about the impact on the right to education through the report that we have I mentioned earlier. I think we have also data that speaks to our meeting today. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, around 23.7 million people were internally displaced as a result of disasters in 2021. The following year, in 2022, the number jumped to 32 million, 0.6. And these are millions of people who are displaced by climate change, by loss of the biodiversity, and who are losing opportunities for learning, and where the continuation of their of learning is threatened. So UNESCO mission, which is about building peace in the minds of men and women, sets education as an important and a master key for sustainable development, for human flourishing, and for ensuring the human rights that we are all responsible and accountable for. In our work, and I would like to mention three dimensions of work that we will be covering today in our meeting and will be taken forward. First of all, let me put it on the first category of a normative work. As you know, we have a document and quite important work on what we call the evolving right to education. This work stems from a perspective that the right to education has to evolve, take into account the new developments. Some of them are related to the demand for an understanding of the impact of early learning, of adult learning, and a lifelong learning perspective that is important. But some of them are also related to the digital impact and the digital transition. And in our discussion today is also about the impact of a climate change on the right to education and how we can address those challenges. So part of our work is to look at the 1960 Convention and recommendations on the right to education, place that within the human right and socioeconomic and cultural right, and see how we can look in this normative dimension with a new eye, looking at those challenges. And that's what our initiative on evolving right to education is covering, and is part also of the work and the report and the work we have been conducting is part of this agenda. So that's on the normative work. The second is related to the policy dimension. And Of course, what we have learned from the analysis that we have conducted and that will be presented by my colleagues, what we are looking at as a result of the work we are doing and the engagement we are having today is to better provide support and advise decision makers on what are the most appropriate policies that have to be in place to address these challenges and to ensure the right to education in this context, particularly for displaced persons because of the climate impact. And I was mentioning some of the data that we have. So a policy dimension is important, and we are working, and based on the discussion today, based on the different engagement, we are working to develop resources, guidelines, policy support to decision makers. The third dimension of our work is also about programs, is about changing on the ground. And I'm happy to mention the Greening Education Partnership that we launched in the context of the Transforming Education Summit that took place in New York last year. As you know, the summit was convened by the Secretary General to put the discussion on education at the highest level, at the level of head of states and government. And one of the spotlight of the Transforming Education Summit is the Greening Partnership and the Greening Education Partnership that covers different aspects that my colleagues will mention, but it's about changing the curricula, it's about changing the quality assurance of education institution, it's about teachers and the teaching staff, and it's about communities. And my colleagues will develop further. But the programmatic aspect is this greening partnership that I wanted to mention. Let me say that all this cannot be done only by UNESCO. It's done in a partnership. Our collaboration with the UNU is one of the reflection of that partnership. But all the work that we are doing is in a partnership with the UN family, but also with the different networks, with member states and other stakeholders that can advance our agenda. So, dear colleagues, I'm confident that our discussion today will contribute to accelerating this global discussion and shed light on the importance of these new challenges to fulfill the right to education and in all circumstances and for all, and that your discussion will inform the work that we are doing both on the evolving right to education, on the greening partnership, but also on these resources and guidelines that we would like to develop to support decision makers and member states. I wish us a successful event, and I look forward for the discussion today. Thank you very much, and back to you, Farian.
Initiatives at the normative level, policy level, as well as at the programmatic level to enable our member states to build resilience of the education sector amidst displacement and increased mobility, safeguarding inclusive learning for all. So thank you so much, Burhan, for your insightful overview and please do allow me a very brief interlude to walk you through today's program today. So let me begin. We just listened to Burhan Shakroon, Director, UNESCO. And now, following this, we are going to have a discussion on the impact of climate change and displacement on the right to education. It's in the first segment, our panel is poised to reveal findings from a UNESCO United Nations University regional study focusing on climate displacement and the right to education for displaced individuals in Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Tuvalu, and Vietnam. So in the initial segment, Ms. Rola Momne and Dr. Jongbi Park will elucidate a cross-case analysis, drawing key insights from the 5 case studies in the Asia-Pacific region and offer a comparative regional analysis. Following this, we look forward to a session on trends development of the impact of climate change on human displacement and the right to education. What are our challenges and what measures can we take? And here we will listen to Dr. Chongrat Tinagul from Thailand, and Anindya Datta from the International Organization for Migration, Thailand. This is going to be followed by a session which we will have then on, the Greening Education Partnership with Ms. Rika and Deepali Gupta from the Global Partnership for Education. So let me just move forward. Our gratitude. We have with us Ms. Rola Mumne from UNESCO Paris headquarters. She has her PhD from the University of Paris Panthéon Assas and is known for her work on the Right to Education program at UNESCO headquarters. She brings her considerable knowledge and experience in the field. And Dr. Jongvi Park is the head of innovations and education at the United Nations University, IAS, and is a champion on innovative and inclusive use of technology for sustainable development. So, Rola, let us begin with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ferial. I am really glad to be here with you, joining virtually. Let me maybe just share my screen, and please let me know if you can see it or not see it. Okay, so just to let you know that my presentation today will focus on the global initiative and the work that we have been conducting for the last 3 years, which looks at the adaptation aspects and mitigating the effect of climate change on the right to education. And this is precisely the work that framed the development of the regional report. So this work that we have been conducting contributes to the different pillars of the Greening Education Partnership that Mr. Shakroun was referring to in his opening remarks. We know that the effects of climate change are, of course, well known today and widely researched. However, one aspect that has been coming into the forefront of the agenda, the policy agenda, is its effect on human mobility. While there has been, I would say, extensive literature regarding the specific linkages between climate-induced displacement and other rights, there have been little information on the specific nexus between climate change, displacement, and the right to education. And we know that persons displaced or affected by climate change and its effects face, of course, significant, but also very specific barriers to education. So this is important to take into consideration. And of course, we know that their number is constantly increasing. So it is in this context that UNESCO launched an initiative to investigate and address the barriers and challenges to education posed by climate-related displacement. The objectives of this initiative is simply to provide operational policy guidance for policymakers that help fulfill the right to education and ensure inclusion in national and regional systems for those affected by climate change. So very briefly, this initiative involves basically 3 main milestones. It was first launched with the publication of a general policy paper containing a literature review on this issue and general recommendations. This was followed by regional research that was conducted in 4 sub-regions based on country case studies from which common and emerging trends are identified, and also legal and policy recommendations are made at regional level. Last year, an expert seminar was organized to review and confirm the preliminary findings, but also to stimulate a global dialogue around these issues, which definitely need more visibility internationally, but also nationally, I would say. The regional research is summarized in regional reports and there has been published. The Asia and Pacific research was the first one that was conducted. Other regions followed and was based on extensive and comprehensive case studies conducted in 5 countries. That's why the report is an important one in terms of guidance and recommendations made. And I would like to again thank very much our collaboration with UNU EAS. The purpose of the regional synthesis report is to gather empirical data on the barriers to education, identify patterns of climate displacement in different contexts, and also develop, as I was mentioning, tailored regional-based operational policy recommendations for the different scenarios. So from the research, some trends are emerging. Ranging from use of schools as emergency shelters, preventing, of course, the continuation of education, climate-induced losses, especially in rural areas, resulting in economic migration, exacerbation of poverty, leading to lower resilience to climate-induced barriers to education, destructions of schools due to inadequate building and disaster management plans, pre-existing inequalities becoming structural barriers to displaced persons to accessing the right to education, to also climate displaced persons facing sometimes administrative and language barriers to quality education, as well as trauma and discrimination, inconsistent and disintegrated disaster response policies and measures across government sectors, and planned relocation plans not necessarily systematically addressing the continuity of education. And we found several commonalities across the different regions. Based on this report and other regions, a global guidance will be released end of this year, which will highlight basically I would say the importance of funding and technical solutions to prepare large-scale displacement, the importance to create a clear and comprehensive legal definition of internally displaced person that includes those temporarily or permanently displaced by climate change, the importance to create policy initiative dedicated to the rights of displaced people, and to specifically protect their right to education. Also, the importance to establish a concept of climate refugee and legally binding framework to ensure access to education. Also, policymakers need to collect data to close the knowledge gap and develop evidence-based laws and policies, pursue bilateral, multilateral agreements for migration, increase resilience, accessibility, and availability of schools to climate change, and strategize for resilience in the education system through policy and planning in order to anticipate risks and respond to the needs. We need to develop cross-sectoral cooperation policies, linking education policies with disaster risk reduction and management policies. Very quickly, regarding the next step, beyond the present phase, we are aiming to truly create impact in countries and regions. So we plan to operationalize the policy recommendations and guidance developed through primary 3 actions: technical assistance and capacity development. Technical assistance to policymakers and member states and capacity development, advocacy actions, and also inclusion of the right to education of people affected by climate change in the review of the international normative framework as part of the current evolving right to education initiative that Mr. Shakroun was referring to earlier. I thank you very much.
And now we will pass the floor to Dr. Jongwee Park from the United Nations University. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Variel. Can I see my presentation file? Yes, thank you. Okay, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. As the principal investigator, I thank UN ESCAP for inviting us to share these important findings of the Asia-Pacific Regional Study on the climate change, displacement, and the right to education. Okay. Next slide, please. The clicker doesn't work. Okay. In Asia Pacific, due to the combination of the population density, rapid urbanization, and also the geographical characteristics, climate change related human displacement is more serious than any other regions. Specifically in figures, if you see there, Asia Pacific accounts for 80% of the total global climate related displacement from 2008 to 2020. In 2021 alone, 57 million people were severely affected by climate disasters in the region, which is much larger than the number of refugees by conflicts and wars. Today, I'm going to present some key findings from a joint research done by UNESCO and UNU-IAS in 2022, focusing on Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Tuvalu, and Vietnam. I cannot possibly present a rich and extensive study finding of the region. So if you are interested in this study, please scan the QR code on the screen and download the full report, which includes the detailed country case reports. Okay, next slide, please. So let me summarize the study in 5 key lessons. First, our region faces diverse scenarios of climate mobility. It ranges from forced displacement by rapid and sudden onsets, such as landslides, storms, floods, to seasonal and voluntary migration by slow onsets, such as sea level rise and land inundation. And also our region features some government planned relocation. Interestingly, we also found that some people chose to stay put or trapped at will, we call it, despite of slow onsets or recurring disasters. Each scenario creates unique barriers for children and adults to access to education, which would require equally unique policy intervention. To do that, to provide uniquely tailored policy intervention, we need data, which is our second lesson. We need data to enable us to prioritize the right learner population who would be most susceptible to the impact of climate change. For example, we found that most of the emergency aids right after a disaster occurs universally goes to younger children or family with young children. This is great, but we have to remember that disaster-induced school closure significantly increases the dropout of secondary education, especially in Bangladesh, India, and Indonesia. We should note that education in these countries are already challenged in a low completion rate of the secondary schools, even without the climate disaster, leading to hindering their progress in SDG number 4, which is education for all. Third, the Education Ministry is seldom part of disaster management plan or national climate adaptation master plan or nationally determined commitments. What this means is that these important national plans wouldn't include a budget for emergency educational responses, such as additional textbooks or learning materials when the landslides or floods swept away a village or households. So the students don't have textbooks, and it really, our research findings shows that they really hinder the students from coming back to school because of the loss of their textbooks. And school buildings if it survives through those disasters, are most likely to be used as a disaster shelter, which will further interfere with student learning. Fourth, we should also remember that displaced people are not just children, but it includes adults and adolescents. Our research found that the displaced adults felt decreased opportunities for their much needed lifelong learning after moving or displacement. Their needs for lifelong learning range from new language learning when they are moving to another village or another country even, reskilling and upskilling training for their new job prospects in the new settlement, and proper DRR education for those who chose to stay in their home village despite the slow onset of the climate impact. We found that due to the limited opportunities for lifelong learning, the marginalized people who were already extremely vulnerable, even before the disaster, are further marginalized. Last, but probably the most importantly, we should not forget teachers are also victims. This picture shows a teacher compound which was totally damaged by flood. As you can see on the screen from a student interview, teachers' return to school is usually very much delayed and children lose their learning days. So teachers need focused financial support to get back on their own feet. On the other hand, teachers also need adequate training to provide psychological support to students who were traumatized by the experiences of the disaster. Finally, they need systematic support for delivering climate change education and DRR education as well. With these findings, I would like to summarize 5 policy recommendations. First, okay. First, include education sector in the National Climate Adaptation Plan and provide clear mandate to education sector in nationally determined commitment. Second, collect disaggregated data and longitudinal data to accurately project impact of multiple mobility scenarios of climate displaced people to education. Third, provide lifelong learning opportunities for climate displaced persons to ensure their smooth adjustment and transition and social economic well-being in a newly settled home. Fourth, prioritize teachers, please. Just like what we did for medical staff during the pandemic. Teachers are soldiers at forefront when disaster hits who can beat the learning disruption caused by climate disaster, but we need to support them. Finally, international agreement and conventions to recognize the states of the cross-border climate displaced persons is urgently needed for. I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jongbi. Looking at Rola's presentation and looking at the Asia Pacific studies, it becomes clear that the findings are suggesting that learning disruption, whether it's seasonal or long-term, it exacerbates vulnerability of the learners who are displaced by, climate situations, and this can risk further exclusion for them. You mentioned that the marginalized groups, the young, the girls in particular, are even more affected when it comes to risks to further exclusion. So and then in the recommendations, I think the policy recommendations that are coming out of this study really suggest that we need intervention at local levels, but then also at the global level and regional levels. So we really need to, join hands across all levels to have effective response. Thank you so much for these insightful presentations so that we can learn lessons at the global level, but then also specifically from Asia Pacific. Now let us turn to Dr. Chongrak Tinagul and Mr. Anindya Datta, who will share their valuable experiences on the challenges and opportunities faced in the light of climate change, and they will also discuss how we can enable resilience and preparedness to ensure inclusive quality education for all displaced individuals and learners. So Dr. Chongrak Tinagul, she's the director of the Climate Change Cooperation Promotion Division at the Department of Environmental Quality Protection in Thailand. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of the audience. Good morning and good evening to the online audience. The trend of climate change related human displacement and challenge to education in Thailand. And I agreed with Dr. Chongwei very much because it is so many linked to the activity in Thailand. But we have a lot of gap to work to come up to help for the people in the displacement, and it is very gap and challenge to education in Thailand. The next slide. Next slide, please. Everybody may know that Thailand is a rank of 9 of the most climate change disaster published by Global Climate Risk Index 2021. And in the future, maybe 2050, the million of Thais may be disaster due to flooding and sea level rise. The country suffering many disasters, not less than 160 crisis cases for 10 years. There are many cases around the country as well. If you see next slide, the northern of Thailand is a high area. There are many mountains, Bantat and Dong Phaya Yen, and that connect to Myanmar and Laos. It is landslides. The event it's so often, and also in the northeast of Thailand, it's a drought, and in the middle of Thailand is a flood, and in the south of Thailand also sea level, coastal erosion, storm. It caused loss and damage, economic and social impact, and vulnerable groups were hit harder. If you see in the right-hand side, the area all around Thailand are expected flooding. The model by the RCP 4.5 and also RPC 8.5 also liked the same picture. Next slide, please. I would like to show the classic case, Ban Khun Samut Jin, the critical area of coastal erosions. Also the area loss of sediments deposits due to the construction and many barriers from upstreams, also sea rise level. The man in the slide said that he's already, for 20 years, he already moved for 4 times from his home. And the other said that the one already moved from his house 11 times. And the causes was retreat about 2 or 3 kilometers. And many organizations, government include DQP, my organization, support the case lots of research go to went to this area, and lots of activities such as create a wave barrier with the bamboo line, electric pole line, plant mangrove tree, and it's only short time, short period, got a budget, and then when finish the project, they will still there. It is for, it's maybe for 24, 40 years ago. And now that recently, it's some area decreased because they did it by themselves. They try on many styles, on many local innovation for plant bamboo line for long, for 4.7 kilometers. And it's good news that some area decreased the erosion, and one area there was an increase the soil sediments about 20 to 85 centimeters. And this is the case, but some areas the erosion still go on. If you see the next slide, it is a climate master plan 2015 to 2050 for Thailand. The vision is Thailand is resilient to impact of climate change and achieve low carbon society to sustainable development. There are three key approaches: adaptation, mitigation, and capacity building. For adaptation, the priority 6 area, each of area has action plan and implementations. Water resource management, agriculture and food security, tourism, public health, natural resources management, human settlement, and security. And I will say about the human settlement and security in the next slide. And also mitigation cover 8 sectors: electricity generation, transportation, energy industry, waste management, agriculture, forestry, urban management, and capacity building, research and development of technology development mechanism to support climate action, and social awareness raising and capacity building in international corporations. And next slide related to human settlement and security. And please back to human settlement and security. Yes, they are separate into the protection system and structure will be created in the plant. On necessary infrastructure, climate resilient building, and resilient urban planning, agriculture, and the soft mechanism is very important, especially increase capacity of local community and local government, increase community capacity to cope the climate disaster. This is very important to the education to help this in the plant. Next slide, please. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And the Ministry of Education also have the like a guideline for disaster mitigation in education sector, and also the have the kit book for Thai self school project. Yes, please. And the Department of Environmental Quality Promotion, also the National Focal Point on Action for Climate Empowerment. It is mentioned in Article 6 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and Article 12 in Paris Agreement. It includes 6 elements: education, training, public awareness, public access in information, public participation, and international cooperations. Is to empower all members to security to engage in climate actions. And all elements try to change the behavior for sustainability. Yes, and also climate solutions. This is for example in the 4H in National Focal Point is for support eco school project. It is a whole school approach for in a school have the environmental policy, and it's maybe next time for create the climate change policy as well, and also the curriculum support in the environmental education, natural based learning, and manage schools nature resource, and whole school participations in the linked between school and community around their schools. Yes. Yes. Yep. Yeah, and it's all of this. It is maybe we work, and it's have like a gap between the action and the policy as well. So we need the time to work, and then need like a Dr. Park said that need many information to support. Yeah. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's listen to Mr. Anindya Datta, the Project Officer, Migration Environment and Climate Change, International Organization for Migration. Over to you, Anindya.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving an opportunity to the International Organization for Migration to be here today and share our experience. I think it's good that I'm positioned somewhere in the middle of the session, given that a lot of the speakers have covered more or less the points that I would have raised in my presentation, so it makes my job a bit more easier. But during my brief presentation, I have some slides for reference, but I also speak a bit impromptu as adjusting to the information that has been provided already. I would try to outline the linkages between climate change and human displacement to a large extent, as well as share some key advocacy messages or key messages related to the state of education, or what are the strong areas where education does need to be harped upon, does need to be prioritized more and more. On that note, if I may ask for the first slide, please. Yep. So we spoke about a lot of us spoke about there is an evidence and agreement that climate change does cause human mobility. And the issue is there is evidence. No one's denying the existence of evidence. There's evidence at the regional level. There's evidence at the national level, maybe not so much at the local level. But there is a disagreement in terms of what that evidence means. If the human mobility, what I'm trying to say is if human mobility is, the extent human mobility is caused by climate change, that is always up for debate depending on the policy forum or place where you are. Can I have the next slide, please? The next 2 to 3 slides are some of the key facts and figures which have already been covered. So I will not go into it in detail, but just to lay the salient points in as per the IDMC report that was launched last week, there is a total of 60 million internally displaced population, out of which more than half, about 32.6 million, is due to climate change. Similarly, within Asia, I think the figure is around 23 million, out of which 22.5 million is due to climate change. So here, you see that the evidence is there in terms of the internal displacement being caused by climate change, but in terms of what action that needs to be taken and how to address these issues, those are the things that is still under discussion, and this is where IOM would also like to support the other agencies as well as the member states as well. Next slide, please. Please carry on. So this is a figure specific to East Asia and the Pacific that I mentioned. Next slide, please. So coming to labor migration and climate change. So migration and human mobility and climate change, as per IOM, we feel that it is always linked because migration on its own is also used as an adaptive strategy to climate change, and that is more as labor migration. So we learned about the study that the UNU presented, and I'm from South Asia, so I've actually lived or worked in three of the 5 countries in which the study was conducted. And I've been working on climate change and migration for longer than I care to remember. And these are actual facts. Climate change does occur. Climate change does occur at the grassroots, does occur at the national level. But what happens is there is no straight line. Climate change does not mean that immediately from a village or rural community, people are going for an international migration or people are displaced overnight. And there are people who do for force of circumstances, they do tend to stay where they are because they do not have any other way forward to do that. They have no other adaptation capacity. So these are some of the issues we look at, and I will touch upon this a bit more. But what I'm trying to say is labor migration or the search for employment is a way for people to cope with that effect of climate change over time. And oftentimes in South Asia, we've seen that it is to provide for a better future for their children or the next generation, or harping on education. Migration is often directly tied to the need to provide for education for their children or a better education for their children, as well as adapting to climate change. So for example, building a stronger house so that your house is not blown away by river erosion or sudden floods. These are some of the direct contribution of migration to climate change in that sense. Can I have the next slide, please? In terms of evidence, we have spoken a lot. And here again, the issue is there is evidence, but the evidence is spread around. So there may be a lot of evidence in the Asia Pacific region or in the Pacific Islands, but in other contexts or in the localization aspect, the impact of climate change on local level, that is where the evidence is missing. Can I have the next slide, please? The next slide, please. So when it comes to displacement as well, so we talked about how climate change or displacement affects the impact of education, but we also need to realize that it is often that access to education, which is a coping mechanism for, especially for children. When you're living in a displaced situation, the access to education might be the going to school for 1 or even 2 hours is a psychosocial coping mechanism. It may be the only chance for a hot meal that a child has for the day. So these are important issues that needs to be kept in mind. In terms of key messages that we wanted to share and in terms of links to education. So we have seen that oftentimes what happens is people on the move or when they're affected by climate change, the impact of education or access to education is the first to suffer. Then education, depending on the level of education people have, it is also, it can often make the difference between the resilience they have as well as the vulnerability they have, as well as supporting the migrants' access to learning opportunities so that migrant workers are prepared for the challenges in the future. These are also important. And finally, for policy engagement, and here I think UNESCO and IOM is partnering in this initiative within the UN agencies along with other partners to develop issue-based climate change education materials to inform policymakers in terms of how climate change and migration are interlinked, as well as the importance of education in these things. So these are all important. Next slide, and I'll try to wrap up quickly, if I may extend by a minute or so afterwards. So talking about IOM's work, We work at the research level in terms of data generation and policy advocacy. We work at the operational level in terms of advising member states and our partners to respond to climate change displacement and support climate change displacement population. At the same time, we also work with other stakeholders as well. So just to give two examples of our work, in the Pacific Islands, we are working with the UN agencies and other partners to basically formulate the first of its kind, a rights-based climate change framework or climate mobility framework in the Pacific Islands, which we hope to be adopted by the end of this year. In the ASEAN countries, with the ASEAN Secretariat, we're basically developing a migration outlook, which basically looks at the impact of climate change in the ASEAN member states at the national level, at the local level, the impact or linkages it may have with labor mobility, and what are the policy recommendations that can be undertaken by the member states at the national and local level. Just one or two slides more, if I may. Sure, that's all right. So in terms of our work or in terms of our approach, you see behind me on the screen that we work with a three-pronged approach, whereas we work for people on the move. Then we have to support people on the move. We support people to move from one place to other, but more importantly, for the people who are staying in place or who do not have the ability to move, we're also working with them so that they are able to adapt to their situation based on where they're located. These are some of the work that we have done previously as well. The next slide, please. Some of the priorities for us looking at COP28, which is basically to ensure that the aspect of human mobility is incorporated into the UNFCCC policy dialogues moving forward, and that is better reflected as well in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kinagol and Dr. Anisabetta. Your insights added value, as mentioned, to the discourse and provide timely lessons, evidence, and recommendations that resonate actually beyond our region.
Issues within Asia Pacific, but also globally. I would like to thank our distinguished panelists, and we were hoping to have one or two questions, but perhaps we don't have time anymore. So what we are going to do is I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. Jong-B Park for the next session on the Greening Education Partnership, and we'll take the questions and answers together at the end. Thank you so much for understanding this. Thanks.
Thank you, Veriel, for the moderation, excellent moderation. So we are moving on to the second segment of this session on the Greening Education Partnership. Greening Education Partnership is an open and inclusive community of member states, organizations, and institutions for promoting and enabling every learner to be climate ready. So this was one of the outputs from the Transforming Education Summit from 2022 last year. And we are here today from UNESCO and also a Global Partnership for Education, two speakers. First speaker is Rika Yorozu, the head of Executive Office and Regional Program Coordinator of UNESCO Multi-Sectoral Regional Office in Bangkok. And our second speaker is Ms. Dipali Gupta, the Advocacy and Partnership Specialist of Asia Pacific from Jakarta, from a Global Partnership for Education. Because of the time limit, probably we will just move on to the presentation by Ms. Rika Yorozu. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chong-Wei. And distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen in this room, as well as those connecting online. I'm happy to know we have over 100 people connecting and listening in. So today I have the pleasure to introduce you to the UN Greening Education Partnership, which has been launched in the UN Transforming Education Summit last September. As the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said at the end of the COP27 session, the climate change is a battle for our lives. And what UNESCO and partners through this Greening Education Partnership is committed to do is to use the power of education and lifelong learning to address the climate change. So in UNESCO, the greening education is embedded in the Education for Sustainable Development, ESD, which we are leading the UN agency. And this is focused on the role of education in addressing the climate crisis across the 3 pillars of sustainable development. These are social, economic, and environmental. And currently the ESD for 2030, or the 2020 to 2030 framework for ESD, is really aiming at empowering learners to become agents of change. And for that, we are trying to equip them with knowledge, skills, and behaviors to build environmentally sustainable societies. The next slide, I think we've already heard today from the previous speakers, the greening education is not really included in the education curricula, or the teachers are not really equipped to teach yet. And then when the climate disaster strikes, it's the children from low-income families, migrants, and ethnic minority children, and those with disabilities. They are the ones that are first to lose access to learning. So the UN family is working with the Thai government and other member states to build a competency-based education, which shifts the focus from what learners are expected to know to what learners are expected to do. This would help to take actions based on their own assessment of the situation and not wait for instructions coming from somewhere else. The next slide. So in the Transforming Education Summit and the COP sessions, young people are telling us that they lack the knowledge and understanding on what's really happening on climate change. And they really want to learn through reflective, solution-based, and action-oriented pedagogies to take actions on climate issues. So this means there's a lot of work that we need to do, and it requires a powerful multi-stakeholder alliance to build together the governments and a wide range of stakeholders, and backed by a strong commitment and funding. Next slide. So the main objective of the Greening Education Partnership at the global and the regional level is to really strengthen the synergetic and strategic implementation around 3 areas of operation. First is to better coordinate and collaborate. Second is to have a better knowledge management and research to support the community of practice. And third is to strengthen the advocacy and communication and monitoring of progress. So at this point, I'd really sincerely like to thank the governments of Japan and the United Kingdom for taking their leadership and commitment as co-conveners of the Global Education Partnerships. Next slide. So there are 4 key areas of Greening Education Partnership at the national level and the local levels. The first one is on greening schools, and that means to ensure that education policies are climate smart, schools, facilities, and operations are climate proof, decision-making is inclusive, and the local community is fully engaged. Example that was just explained by Thailand is a good illustration of this. Second is on greening curriculum. This means to ensure that the relevant and quality curriculum and pedagogy on climate change education, from preschool to higher education and lifelong learning. It also means to include green skills and making sure that every learner learns about how to take actions on climate change. Third area is on greening teacher training and education systems capacities. This will be explained further by my colleague next so I won't go deep into this. And lastly, we have the greening communities. This to make sure that there are places for lifelong learning that are really going to be where people are engaged in building climate resilient communities. Next slide. So as explained by Chongyi, the Greening Education Partnership is an open and inclusive one. First group category of member is the member states, and every country willing to take action on greening education is welcome to join this partnership. And second category are a wide range of stakeholders, institutions, and organizations, like people that are joining in this meeting today. I'm very pleased that you have dedicated to this Greening Education Partnership. The link you see on the screen is where one can join and state their commitment. Next slide. So far, in terms of the member states in Asia Pacific, 10 countries have specifically shown interest to join and lead the Greening Education Partnership. The names of countries you see here are those that have specifically identified which area of the Greening Education Partnership they would like to join. Last slide. So there are several regional and global events that are planned to mobilize political and financial support for the Greening Education Partnership this year. In particular, the important one is the Climate Ambition Summit in September, which also this ECOSOC Commission's discussion is bringing forward. And then the COP28 meeting, which will be the venue where the heads of states will be the one to lead the climate change issues. So UNESCO is also working with the UN to establish a multi-partner trust fund to support countries in achieving these commitments on Greening Education Partnership. And we really like to seek our member states and partners to pledge to this new and the first UN multi-partner trust fund in education. Actually, the Global Education Greening Education Partnership Secretariat will be organizing a series of capacity building webinars, online webinars, and there's one today at 6:30 p.m. in Bangkok time that will be focusing on the relation between the Greening Education Partnership and COP28. Next slide. So you find here the contacts in case you have some further questions, and also invite those interested to stay on after this event to discuss the kind of activities that we could take at the Asia Pacific level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rika, for the detailed information about the Greening Education Partnership, the background and the key activities for the year, sorry. Now we are moving on to one of those partners in Greening Education Partnership, which is Global Partnership of Education. So we already talked that we are going to be very confused with GEP and GPE. The beginning. Yes. So Ms. Deepali Gupta will introduce, I think, focusing more on the third pillar of greening teacher training and the systems capacity. Without further ado, I'll invite Ms. Gupta. Floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. Jongwei mentioned, I work for the Global Partnership for Education. So GPE is a unique multi-stakeholder partnership and the largest global fund dedicated specifically to transforming education in countries with the greatest need. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So as you'll see here, our goal is to accelerate access, learning outcomes, and gender equality, all of which are threatened by climate change, through supporting equitable, inclusive, and resilient education systems fit for the 21st century. And as you'll see on the colored regions on the map, we work in over 80 partner countries, 28 of which are in the Asia Pacific region, and many of these are extremely vulnerable to climate change. So as we've heard today, climate change is threatening to put education out of reach for millions of children, and that's why we believe it's essential to make education systems climate smart. Next slide, please. So what is a climate smart education system and what are its goals? So the first is obviously to protect education in times of crisis, but it should also be able to advance quality, relevant, and equitable education. Education also has a critical role to play in shaping human skills, behaviors, values, and attitudes. And so because of that, it can be a big driver to protect the planet. So schools especially touch every community. And if we could mobilize school communities to restore ecosystems and to adopt sustainable practices, this can have an immense impact and contribute to goal 2 listed here. And then finally, as we've heard from everyone today as well, is that we know that climate change is hitting the vulnerable and the most marginalized the hardest, whether that's women and girls, people with disabilities, and refugees, those that are otherwise facing multiple barriers. And so we need an education system that's able to address some of these power asymmetries and create not just a greener society, but also a fairer society. And that's the third goal of a climate smart education system. Next slide, please. So we're proud to be part of the Greening Education Partnership, which is building a growing community of actors to support countries across these 4 pillars. And where, as mentioned, we're particularly focused on systems transformation. And so UNESCO has kindly invited us to co-lead Pillar 3 on building capacity of systems alongside Education International and UNICEF, and to support efforts to mainstream climate considerations into education systems. We've developed a framework that unpacks the entry points for climate action in and through education. And this actually builds on the work of a lot of partners, especially the Heat is On publication series, which was commissioned by UNICEF South Asia, and the work done by Fumio Kagawa and David Selby. Next slide, please. I think we missed one. Sorry, if you can go back, please. Yeah, that's the one. Thank you. And so as our partner countries are facing more intense climate-related challenges, we've had a lot of requests from them on how can we support them to address climate change through the education sector. So we've aimed to make our framework simple and user-friendly, and it consists of 7 dimensions to make education systems more climate smart based on a range of good practices. So here on the screen, you'll see in the outer circle in green, these are the 4 enabling factors. In light blue, we have the inputs to the education system. And in the center, we have schools and communities. And as you can see, gender equality is a cross-cutting issue across all of these. So as we've heard today as well, there is a lot of work going on in all these areas, but often these projects and communities are working on these in silos. And so the value add here is really to help bring all these interdependent elements of the system together. In the interest of time, sorry, if we can stay on the slide for a little bit, please. So in the interest of time, I'll just touch on 2 dimensions of this, but we'll share the framework after. And it actually has some great examples of best practices from the region. So I do hope you'll take a look. So the first is policy and planning, which has come up today as well. So national plans and policies form the foundation for better addressing the connections between education and climate change. And of course, education plans need to take into account how climate change can impact education systems. But it's really important that the role and the contribution of education is also recognized in key national disaster management and climate change plans. And so nationally determined contributions are country commitments basically to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to climate change. And NDCs can help ensure high-level commitment and implementation at all levels, from local to national. But unfortunately, as mentioned earlier by Dr. Jongwi, the education sector remains largely unrecognized in NDCs, despite the role it can play in decarbonization. And so here, a really good example actually is Cambodia's updated NDC. It clearly articulates education's contributions to climate action under the leadership of the Ministry of Education, Youth and Sport. And it includes education-specific actions like including climate change in the curriculum, making school infrastructure more climate resilient, and mainstreaming climate into education plans. So another example here is financing. Here there are actually some interesting opportunities in the international climate financing space to try and unlock some additional funding for education. But to do this, the education community needs to strengthen the case for education-related spending and ensure it's being efficiently done. And we also need to agree on what falls under climate financing in the education sector to help policymakers allocate this and monitor this as well. So here an example is Bangladesh, which has a climate fiscal framework, and with support from UNDP, the Ministry of Finance has actually published 5 annual climate change budget reports, and this traces the climate expenditure across 25 ministries. Next slide, please. So really quickly on this, just to say that as our strategy is focused on systems transformation and dialogue with countries on identifying the bottlenecks in the education systems and figuring out what are the priority reforms for them, this is also a way to enrich the dialogue on systems transformation. And already, about a third of our biggest grants include some support on climate activities, such as developing contingency plans, installing rainwater harvesting systems, etc. And then you can see an example from Laos on the screen, where we're providing support to make early learning facilities climate resilient and training teachers and caregivers. Next slide, please. So we've seen a huge demand for technical assistance to help ministries to assess the potential of different interventions to build climate resilience and to advance climate action through the education sector. So GPA has developed an initiative to provide that support, partnering with UNESCO and Save the Children to work alongside ministries of education to define a climate smart roadmap for the education sector. And currently we're piloting this in Zimbabwe and Malawi. And we will focus on 4 priority areas, which you can see on the screen, where UNESCO and SAVE have offered to deploy their expertise. And countries will come to this with different needs. And so we see this as a menu for countries to choose from and prioritize based on their current efforts. And in June, our board is going to consider whether we can scale up the support to an additional 20 countries, which would include some countries in the Asia Pacific region. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll just wrap up really quickly. So here on the screen, if you would like to have a look at the climate smart education framework I mentioned, please go ahead and scan this. And just to conclude, would like to say that we know that education is very vulnerable, but also that it has an important role to play in fighting climate change. So we really urgently need to come together, not just the education community, but with the climate and the disaster management communities to both to make education systems more resilient, but also use them as a force for greener and more just societies. And to do this, we also need to make sure there's enough financing available to implement these strategies at scale, and also work with the Greening Education Partnership to mobilize the political will to ensure that our education systems are fit for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gupta, for these very interesting cases from around the world. And also, I'm really glad to know that some countries are already including the education sector in the NDCs. And GPE is providing a focused intervention for policy development for education system that should be resilient to all these climate change impacts. Originally, we wanted to have actually 20 minutes for interaction and Q&A, but because of the time limit, we will have probably only 10 minutes for interaction. I've heard from the organizer that we have about 111 people on the online, and also we have 6 important questions from the online participants, but I don't think we can entertain all the questions. So while we are entertaining probably 2 questions from the online, please, if participants on site here have any questions, please prepare so that we have 1 question from the floor on site at the end. So the first question from online. Today's topic discussing Goal 13 and Goal 4 of SDGs synergistically. Furthermore, AP region as one of the most vulnerable regions impacted by climate crisis, the demographic circumstances are various. Are there any specific recommendations regarding this context? Anyone from the panel to respond to this question? Maybe I can respond to this question. Is it okay? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's really correct observation that AP region is actually quite diverse in terms of demographics and the needs, especially in terms of climate effect and education access. In aging society like Japan, Korea, and even Thailand is joining this aging society now, we are actually witnessing a lot of needs and demands for the adults to be more climate literate. We all know that our adults generation, like my generation, has no experiences in the formal education in terms of climate change, adaptation, mitigation, education. So for those countries, we actually need more adult-based or lifelong learning opportunities for climate change education, while some of the countries that are still kind of having a youth purge need more focused intervention on how we can actually continue their completion of secondary and higher education in the context of climate change and impact. So we really need to have a more tailored intervention, not the one-size-fits-all kind of intervention. Any other opinion from the floor on this? Yes, please, IOM.
Sure, maybe a small one. And to add to one of the recommendations that were given in the study would be basically the recognition of climate change, and that is basically the cross-border mobility of population in the international frameworks in terms of ensuring that they have protection, ensuring that they have access to education and other services as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, Ariel. Yes.
I would just like to add that often teachers and the education systems are not prepared to empower learners around these issues of climate change. So it's important to have a systemic response where the policy, strategy, budget, the programs, the curriculum, the teaching and learning in the classroom is aligned and is mainstreaming these issues as part of, what the actual teaching and learning that goes on in the classroom. I think this is going to be a big priority going forward. And this is what we do need, of course, tailored responses. But I think this is something which each country can decide how they want to do it according to their own specific context. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. For that, we really need the data. Okay, the second question from online. Can we see? Next slide, please. Okay, for the time being, maybe we can entertain a question from the floor on site. If there is any question, just open your microphone and ask questions to any panelist. Okay, so, right. So second question from the online then. Okay.
I'm happy for anyone on the panel to answer this, but with regards to adjustments in curricula, such as including DRR and greening education systems, from the curricula to the teachers to the actual physical schools, what kind of time frame do you anticipate for this to be carried across? And further to that, what kind of finance and budget as a proportion of education ministries and schools do you expect that to take up, as well as how would that be sourced?
Thank you very much for the question. Anyone from? Yes.
Sure. I think this question actually links up with another question which is online. So may I just, Jongvi, respond to the questions regarding climate change and school curricula? I think this is really pertinent, and in terms of timeline, this really has to be a participatory process. It should be grassroots up and not coming like top down. So you would need consultations involving a wide range of stakeholders, teachers, educators, learners, different education stakeholders, civil society, private sector. And that does take some time. So countries, they are undertaking curriculum reviews. They are concrete efforts that are being made by member states and the ministries of education to have curriculum review to enable mainstreaming of these issues as part of the curriculum and across subjects. Again, the work that it entails requires, these are cross-cutting interdisciplinary issues. So it means it's not just a standalone issue, but rather languages or geography or civil, different social studies, different subjects, art, can integrate these. So usually, it depends. A curriculum review can take anything from 4 to 6 months up to a year, depending on how intensive the consultative processes. And then of course there needs to be also focus group discussions to, once a consensus is built, then you need to have validation from the target beneficiaries and the stakeholders to endorse it as well. In many countries, sometimes it also becomes controversial because there are different interests. So it can become a sensitive issue as well, because sometimes there are different industries that want to, they are interests that come up. But things are, member states are now including these issues as part of the reforms, systemic response to enable mainstreaming. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Variel. Maybe, yes, please.
Thank you. Just to add to the financing piece of that. So currently, actually, around 2/3 of the resources for education are financed domestically. So actually raising more resources for that, including on the climate piece, will need to include things like improving the tax base and reforming overall financial governance. But we do also know this is a very tricky environment. And so we also need the international community and the private sector to continue to step up. But also just want to reiterate what we mentioned earlier, is that we really do need to think a little more about how we can also leverage some of the climate funds for education as well, and explore these investments, because from what we've been hearing, some of the international climate funds are open to discussing this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gupta. So the second question on the screen actually is related to what we just responded. And actually, UNESCO did a very recent study on climate change education curriculum review of all over the world and on the globe. So maybe you could see the person who about this question, you could see which region actually has more integrated approach in their former curriculum of climate change education, or which region is actually lacking. So you could probably Google climate change education in UNESCO, and then you can see those reports quite clearly and in detail. So with that, probably we should wrap up this session, and we are now inviting Dr. Libing Wang, who will be giving us next steps and some concluding remark. Thank you, Dr. Wang.
Thank you, Junwei. On behalf of UNESCO, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to all the participants, either in person or virtually, for joining this side event on this very important issue of climate change and its impact on the right to education. During the first part of the event, we heard from diverse experts from UNESCO, from UNUIAS, IOM, and also our host country of Thailand, about how climate change drives human displacement, and how this displacement causes different barriers to education. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate on the launch of the Asia-Pacific Regional Synthesis about climate change, displacement, and the right to education. I think there's a lot of concepts around us. For UNESCO, we have usually dealing with movement of professionals, and we also see a lot of terms like mobility of people. And I think this kind of displacement is a kind of forced mobility by some, factors that we cannot control, right? So this is really the things that we can find some the synergies, among different UN agencies and also among different organizations. I think during the second part of the event, we also learned about Greening Education Partnership, which is an important global initiative emerged from the Transforming Education Summit, focusing on focusing on getting every learner climate ready. Up to now, we are happy to see that more than 40 countries across the globe joined this partnership. Among them, 10 are from this region, including Brunei, Darussalam, Cambodia, Cook Island, Japan, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Tajikistan, and we very much hope that more countries can join this partnership. But we would also like to encourage delegates and the representatives from other organizations working on climate change education to join this partnership. As you all are aware, the theme of this 79th Commission session of ESCAP is accelerating climate action in Asia and the Pacific for sustainable development. UNESCO believes that taking action to combat climate crisis is closely linked to fostering peace. Climate crisis is not only an environmental issue, it's also a social and a political issue. And if you allow me, I would like also to say that it's also have economic and a cultural impact. Climate crisis causes migration, refugees, poverty, food crises across the globe. And climate change is considered as the greatest risk to peace. Consequently, addressing climate change cooperatively around the world could contribute towards building and sustaining peace. I would also like to take this opportunity to respond to some of the questions I raised, because 2 points I would like to share with you is really that we would not like that we keep adding things to the already very crowded curriculum at the schools. And what we want is really to identify the key skills, competencies, even values and attitude, which are really related to climate change education. You cannot keep adding things because it's already very crowded. And I think all the curriculum should be linked with skills, competencies, values and attitudes, which are really contributing to the climate change awareness building, capacity building, and also, how can I say, to integrate this kind of skills and competencies, values and attitudes into our daily life. I sincerely wish that today's discussion will foster collaboration between member states and organizations to address climate change through the empowering education together. Thank you once again for your participation, and climate change and the right to education is really the key challenges facing us. And I would also like to thank UNU IAS for co-organizing this event together with UNESCO. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Li-Bing Wang, for your concluding remark and also guiding us for the next steps. Thank you very much for joining us today on site and also online participants. I was told that the recording of the session will be available soon by UNESCO. So maybe you could share how we can access to those recordings. Yes, and then all the presentation files also will be available for anyone who wants to have more information. Thank you very much again and have a great evening. Thank you.